Dobro večer, ja sam Andi Mioč, dobrodošli u novo izdanje emisije Preko granice. Večeras vas očekuje mnogo informacija o jednom od glavnih svjetskih pitanja kao i vijesti koje vjerovatno nećete čuti drugdje. Glavna tema večeras su odnosi Kine i Tajvana ili Narodne republike Kine i Republike Kine. Tajvan je otok udaljen nekih 150 km od jugoistočne obale kopnene Kine i dom je za oko 23 miliona stanovnika. Za Peking, Tajvan je odmetnuta kineska provincija koja će kad tad postati dio Kine. Predsjednik Xi Jinping je obećao ujedinjenje sa Tajvanom i rekao da ono mora biti provedeno, a nije isključio ni moguću upotrebu sile. Tajvan, s druge strane, vidi sebe kao nezavisnu državu sa sopstvenim ustavom i demokratski izabranim vodstvom. Tajvanska predsjednica Tsai Ing-wen je obećala da Tajpej neće pokleknuti pritisku Pekinga i da će braniti svoj demokratski način života. Rascjep između Tajpeja i Pekinga korijene vuče od kraja Drugog svjetskog rata. U Kini je tada izbio sukob između snaga nacionalističke vlade i komunističke partije. Komunisti su izvojevali pobjedu 1949. godine i njihov lider Mao Tse-tung je preuzeo vlast u Pekingu, dok su nacionalisti predvođeni Chiang Kai-shekom pobjegli na obližnji otok Tajvan. Nakon godina napetosti u međunarodnoj zajednici, 1971. godine iz UN-a je izbačena Republika Kina, odnosno Tajvan, a Narodna republika Kina, odnosno Peking, se vratio u Ujedinjene nacije. To je dovelo do tenzija koje traju i danas. U prošloj godini Kina je pojačala pritisak na Tajvan. U zonu zračne odbrane Tajvana, samoproglašeno područje u kojem Tajpej vrši identifikaciju i monitoring stranih letjelica radi interesa nacionalne sigurnosti, Peking je u više navrata poslao veći broj borbenih aviona i bombardera. Rekord je zabilježen u oktobru 2021. kada je u samo jednom danu identificirano 56 aviona kineske narodno-oslobodilačke vojske. Kina na odbranu troši manje samo od Sjedinjenih država i u slučaju vojnog konflikta ima širok spektar mogućnosti od močinjene mornarice preko raketa, avijacije i sajber napada. Kineska vojska redovno izvodi vježbe na koje kritičari gledaju kao na pripreme za invaziju. Vježbe tajvanske vojske uglavnom se fokusiraju na sprečavanje iskrcavanja na obale otoka. Pojedini zapadni analitičari smatraju da bi Tajvan u najboljem slučaju mogao samo usporiti kineski napad pokušajima sprečavanja iskrcavanja pomorsko-desantnih snaga i izvođenjem gerilskih napada u čekanju pomoći svana. Pomoć Tajvanu mogla bi doći od SAD-a koji već prodaje oružje Tajpeju, iako se pridržava zvanične politike strateške neodređenosti. To u praksi znači da je Washington namjerno nejasan o svojim namjerama da li bi zaštitio Tajvan u slučaju napada. Sjedinjene države se, kao i velika većina zemalja svijeta, pridržava diplomatske politike jedne Kine, koja prepoznaje samo jednu kinesku vladu, onu u Pekingu, bez zvaničnih veza sa Tajpejem. Trenutno samo 13 zemalja svijeta i Vatikan priznaju Tajvan kao suverenu državu. Kina vrši ogroman diplomatski pritisak na druge zemlje da ne priznaju Tajvan ili preduzmu bilo koji korak u tom smjeru. Posljednji slučaj suprotstavljanja kineskom pritisku desio se u novembru 2021. godine kada je u Litvaniji otvoreno predstavništvo Tajvana. Peking je odmah protjerao litvanskog ambasadora i povukao svog ambasadora iz Viljnusa, a u decembru su uveli blokadu uvoza litvanske robe kao i izvoza u tu zemlju. Evropska unija je u januaru ove godine pokrenula spor u Svjetskoj trgovinskoj organizaciji protiv Kine zbog diskriminacije litvanskih i proizvoda drugih zemalja članica koji sadrže litvanske komponente. A sada dolazimo do dijela zašto je Tajvan toliko bitan cijelom svijetu. Taj otok proizvodi više od 90% naprednih poluprovodnika, kompjuterskih čipova koji pokreću gotovo sve tehnološke gadžete, automobile, računare i medicinsku opremu. Radi konteksta, samo jedna tajvanska fabrika poluprovodnika TSMC drži više od pola svjetskog tržišta. Vrijednost industrije poluprovodnika u prošloj godini je procijenjena na više od 555 milijardi američkih dolara. Tu u igru ulaze i Sjedinjene države. Kinesko preuzimanje Tajvana bi Pekingu donijelo kontrolu nad jednom od najvažnijih industrija svijeta, kao i mogućnost kontrole nad zapadno-pacifičkom regijom, što bi moglo dovesti do ugrožavanja američkih vojnih baza na Havajima ili u Guamu. A šta o ujedinjenju sa Kinom misle građani Tajvana i kakva je situacija na otoku, reći će nam Marcin Jerževski, istraživač fondacije Next Gen Taiwan, koji u Tajpeju predvodi istraživački program New Southbound Policy. Dobroveče, Marčine. Kako vi gledate na aspiracije Pekinga da ujedini zemlju? Xi Jinping je rekao da bi volio da taj proces protekne mirno, ali da Peking neće tolerirati separatizam.
Unfortunately, China has been increasingly aggressive vis-à-vis Taiwan. It's a part of a broader strategy pursued by Beijing to consolidate the regime and ensure regime stability through heavy-fisted rule and through intimidation, through appealing to nationalist sentiments. 2021 was a record year in terms of intrusions of airplanes of the People's Liberation Army into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And that's just one of many examples of so-called hybrid warfare or gray zone warfare that Beijing is projecting vis-à-vis Taiwan. But in your question, you mentioned this term separatism. And when we talk about the dynamics between Taiwan and China, or the People's Republic of China with its capital in Beijing and the Republic of China with its capital in Taipei, we have to bear in mind that Taiwan was actually never governed by the People's Republic of China since its establishment in 1949. So the claim to Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan is deeply flawed. The history of Taiwan reveals that the island was subject to rule of many different regimes, starting with the Dutch colonization in the 17th century, through a loyalist Ming government after the fall of the Ming dynasty in the Chinese mainland, then the Qing dynasty rule, brief periods of Spanish colonization in the north as well, then a 50-year period of Japanese colonization from 1895 to 1945, and then the subsequent rule of the Republic of China. So the history of Taiwan is very complicated, and the country has its distinct identity and distinct history that has been shaped by interactions with all these different powers and not only Chinese people. And something that China is often conveniently trying to forget is that Han Chinese people might constitute 95% of Taiwan's population, but they're not the only inhabitants of the island. As a matter of fact, Taiwan is an important place in the broader map of Austronesian culture, with 2.5% of the Taiwanese population coming from one of the 16 recognized and several more unrecognized indigenous communities. So the desire to forcibly annex Taiwan in China is on the rise, and this is a reason for concern to not only Taiwan, but also its allies, countries such as Japan, the United States. Increasingly, also other important players in the Indo-Pacific have expressed their interest in those perilous dynamics. But one point that I'm really trying to drive home here is that the PRC's claim to Taiwan does not really have a solid foundation.
Kako se građani Tajvana osjećaju povodom želja Pekinga? Kakvo je javno mišljenje? Da li se protive politici ujedinjenja?
There is no desire for unification in Taiwan. There is a fantastic survey, a longitudinal study that has been carried out by one of the major universities here in Taipei, the National Zhengzhi University, that has been tracking public attitudes towards the future relationship of Taiwan and China. And people who call for immediate unification are in low single digits. That's 1 to 2% of respondents. This is really a marginal sentiment. A majority of people in Taiwan call for either the preservation of the status quo or preserving the status quo while slowly and gradually moving towards full independence. We also need to understand that the Republic of China already functions as a de facto sovereign independent state, even though the number of formal diplomatic allies of the ROC continues to dwindle. Taiwan has been able to devise an idiosyncratic model of engagement with its international partners through informal diplomacy, through channels such as those we see in its current dynamics with Lithuania, for example. These are informal diplomatic channels that perhaps don't fully correspond to the very traditional nation-state concept, but that allow Taiwan to play an important role in international politics. And that's something that the Taiwanese public is clearly recognizing. There has been a new exciting survey that recently came out of the Brookings Institution that points to attitudes that Taiwanese people hold towards Chinese culture and the PRC's political system. So even though a considerable chunk of respondents is recognizing the fact that there are similarities in Taiwan's culture and China's culture, there is a resounding opposition to the current political system in the PRC. And of course, a unification or forced annexation of Taiwan by China would mean the imposition of the totalitarian political system that we are seeing in the PRC. That has definitely been the case in Hong Kong. And Taiwanese people are looking at the case of Hong Kong as a potential blueprint for this kind of forced assimilation. And that is not a path that people in Taiwan want to follow. An overwhelming majority of respondents is very clear about their opposition to a very different model of politics pursued on the other side of the strait.
Kada spominjete mogućnost aneksije i upade u prostor Tajvana, kakva je situacija sa industrijom poluprovodnika? Znamo da je Tajvan odgovoran za više od 90% svjetske proizvodnje. Kakve bi posljedice na tu industriju mogle imati tenzije?
Absolutely. I would just very briefly like to clarify that the incursions of the People's Liberation Army were into Taiwanese ADIZ, not Taiwanese airspace. I understand that these are subtleties that we care about in the field of IR, but ADIZ and Taiwanese airspace are different. So there have been no known intrusions into the Taiwanese airspace, just the defense identification zone. But with regard to security implications for the semiconductor industry, this is a very valid question. Of course, the semiconductor industry is also an important source of Taiwan's reputation in the international system, an important guarantor of its strategic importance to its key partners, such as the United States. As of now, cross-strait tensions have not had a very significant impact on the operations of the semiconductor industry. The semiconductor industry and the industry giants such as TSMC have been affected by so-called non-traditional security threats. So, for example, last year in Taiwan, the shortage of water was an issue that could have potentially affected production capacity. And so was the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, with several clusters in industrial zones discovered in the summer of last year. But of course, the security risk is there, and players in the industry are not indifferent to those threats. And one mitigation strategy that has been on the rise is diversification. Diversification is, of course, a powerful tool in risk mitigation. And what I mean by diversification here is attempt to move some of the production of semiconductors outside of Taiwan. There is a flagship project that TSMC is realizing in Arizona. A major semiconductor factory will be built in that southwestern state. But of course, in the context of Taiwan's relations with the European Union and Europe in general, there is an increasing hunger for moving some of Taiwanese technology, some of Taiwanese production bases to Europe. This coincides with the work of the European Commission on the European Chips Act. So already during the visits of the Taiwanese delegation to Lithuania, plans were laid out to develop capacity of specifically Lithuania to become a part of the semiconductor manufacturing chain. So diversification and moving the production, moving certain parts of the supply chain outside of Taiwan is a way in which the industry is trying to respond to this growing threat from China.
Spomenuli ste slučaj Litvanije. Tajvan je tamo otvorio de facto ambasadu, što je izazvalo oštre kritike Pekinga, kao i zabranu uvoza iz Litvanije te izvoza u tu zemlju. Zbog toga je Evropska unija pokrenula postupak u Svjetskoj trgovinskoj organizaciji. Kako će se prema vašem mišljenju ponašati Evropska unija? Mislite li da će Litvanija biti usamljeni primjer dobrih odnosa s Tajvanom?
If I may, Lithuania is definitely a guinea pig. It's an experimental case for China that will allow Beijing to test how far it can afford to go, what it can actually afford to do when it comes to the deployment of its negative economic statecraft vis-a-vis individual member states and also the EU as a whole. So the response from Brussels has to be strong, it has to be resounding, and it has to reaffirm players around the world, including and especially including China, that European unity is not just a cliche, but it is a foundation of EU's dealings with the world. So unfortunately, up to this point, the response of the European Union has remained rather lackluster. Tools such as the anti-coercion mechanism still remain undeveloped. So the case of Lithuania clearly demonstrates that the European Union needs to rethink its engagement with China. It needs to rethink how it can effectively protect itself and its member states by implementation of appropriate tools of its common foreign and security policy. There are some positive developments. For example, Slovenia was another Eastern European government that announced a desire to exchange representatives with Taiwan, to deepen ties with Taiwan. We need to bear in mind that the expansion of ties with Taiwan doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's not only about finding a substitute for China. It's not only about how individual states are trying to shape their relationship with Beijing and Taipei. The newfound openness towards Taiwan is a part of broader pivot to the Indo-Pacific and the economic opportunities that the development of the Indo-Pacific concept brings about. So the Lithuanian case will continue to be monitored very closely by global stakeholders, and most importantly, it will remain a test for the European Union and its unity.
Marčine, hvala lijepa za vaše viđenje i što ste govorili za Preko granice.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
O značaju Tajvana u geopolitičkoj utrci velesila i mogućim scenarijima koje Peking može provesti kada je riječ o ujedinjenju zemlje, odnosno preuzimanju Tajvana, u nastavku razgovaramo sa Jurijem Poitom, šefom azijskog odjela New Geopolitics Research Networka, koji je trenutno u Kijevu. Dobroveče, Juri. Kako vi vidite poziciju Tajvana u trenutnoj geopolitičkoj borbi i utrci velesila između Vašingtona i Pekinga i kakvu ulogu u tim odnosima igra tajvanska napredna industrija?
Good evening. It's a nice pleasure for me to participate in this program, and I will try to share my opinions, my insight, not only from Ukraine but also as a specialist from Asia, as I were in China many times, and also I researched Chinese foreign policy not only in the region but in the world. So Taiwan, I believe that Taiwan now is one of the most important issues in the international relations, because the United States foreign policy based on the framework, based on the structure, on the system where allies are very important to strengthen, to building up the United States capabilities, and together with allies, the United States tried to maintain its power, to maintain its economy, etc. And Taiwan is in the Asia Pacific region, and it is one of the most important the United States allies together with Japan, with Korea, with India, and other countries. Taiwan is not only about economy, but from my point of view, it's more about security, more about defense, because together with Taiwan, using Taiwan's territory, using Taiwan's assistance, the United States could project its power not only near its border, but also in other regions. And this strategic competition between China and the United States started a few years ago, and we can observe that the United States trying to increase its relation, to deepen its relation with allies. That's why I believe that Taiwan is in the dimension of security, dimension of defense, dimension of economy, is very important partner for the United States. And it's also kind of source of difficulties for China, because according to the Chinese national document, according to the Chinese strategy, Taiwan is the part of the mainland of China. That's why we can observe, some kind of competition between these two great powers. And you mentioned also technology. Semiconductors issue is also very important, because Taiwan is one of the most huge producing site in the world of semiconductors, of technology developing, of this kind of thing.
Kako gledate na izjave Xi Jinpinga o ujedinjenju s Tajvanom? Vjerujete li da bi Kina mogla izvršiti prisilnu aneksiju otoka?
It's also very interesting issue, very complicated, I would say, multidimensional. And from my point of view, it's impossible to say if China do it or not, if China dare to do it or not, and in what way exactly. By using its soft power or economic pressure or just unification, peaceful unification, or even using military force or military threat. When we analyze this issue, we can learn, we can observe it from the three dimensions. The first one is papers, I mean strategic papers, strategic documents of China. The second is words of its leadership, of Chinese leadership, including Mr. Xi Jinping, his speech, etc. And another dimension is action. When it comes to the papers, we can observe that unification of the country and returning of Taiwan to China is one of the most significant, one of the key elements of Chinese strategy, and one of the most significant aims of its foreign policy. It's a kind of key priority. There are very much information about one China policy, one China principle, and most of the countries, most of the nations all over the world follow this one China policy principle. According to them, diplomatic relations could be only with Beijing, but not with Taiwan. So every country could maintain economic relation with Taiwan, but not political relation, I mean. And there are only few countries in Asia Pacific that have diplomatic relation with China and with Taiwan, and their number is decreasing. And when we look at the constitution of China, we can see that Taiwan is sacred territory of China, and is a great aim of unification of the nation. And it is duty of the all Chinese people. It's written in the constitution. When we look at other documents, for instance, the white paper, China military defense, the main threat and the main risk for the China is considered independence of Taiwan. So China is going to do everything, all instruments, using all instrument, all leverage to unify the country. When we look at the discourse of its leadership, including Xi Jinping, we can observe the same situation, the same thing, that unification of Taiwan is very important. But we also can observe another aspect, that China could use its military power to unify with Taiwan. And it is very, very interesting, and sometimes it could be, challenging also for China, for Taiwan, for neighbors, etc. And during 100th anniversary speech, Xi Jinping, it was 1 year ago, Xi Jinping also stressed on that. When we look at the third dimension, from my point of view, is the most interesting, is action. What China really do on the Taiwan direction, we can observe consistent steps in order to returning the island. For instance, we can observe the increasing activity of intelligence, including military intelligence, political intelligence, and its activity is very high. We can observe the PLA activity, PLA, People Liberation Army, and we can see that PLA is consistently preparing for the war. It's not going to start the war right now, or maybe in 1 year, or maybe even in 10 years. But PLA is preparing for that, because we can observe military drills near Taiwan, including attack on the island. We can observe the building up its navy, its marine corps, its air forces, particularly on the Taiwan direction. And we can observe, for instance, aircraft invasions in anti-aircraft zone of Taiwan, and China does its regular. So there are also lots of other actions that China do. It's called the Great Operation Zone, so-called 9-dash, building up artificial islands in South China Sea, and as I said, aircraft invasion, something like that. But from my point of view, and I had a lot of discussion and conversation with other experts on China, including Japanese experts, including Western experts, and very few believe that China will return Taiwan by force right now or in the nearest future, because the Chinese, the main goal, the strategic goal is to become superpower in economic perspective, in technology dimension, and also in military. Actually, China is not ready in military. China is not ready to return Taiwan by force, and China is continuing to building up its military capabilities, as I mentioned. China is going to become the number one economic country. It is going to be by 2030s, something like that. GDP of China is increasing very, very fast, about 6% per year and more. And the dependency of other countries in the world is increasing on China. That's why the Chinese main goal is to become a superpower, and then maybe they will be resolving the issue of Taiwan. But if China invade Taiwan right now, simultaneously, for instance, with the action of Russia on Ukraine direction, it will not facilitate the Chinese main goal to become a superpower. It will severely deteriorate the international situation around China. It will severely harm the Chinese image on international relation, etc. So there will be lots of risk, lots of threats to China. That's why I believe that Taiwan issue for China is long-term, is strategic, and it will depend on different aspects, not only on the current situation.
Hvala vam, Juri, što ste govorili za Preko granice.
Thank you very much. It was a nice pleasure for me.
To bi bilo sve o centralnoj temi. Slijede neke drugčije novosti. U spektakularnom otkriću astronomi observatorije Leiden u Nizozemskoj pronašli su do sada najveću galaksiju. Alkioneus je divovska radiogalaksija udaljena oko 3 milijarde svjetlosnih godina od nas. Proteže se na oko 16,3 miliona svjetlosnih godina u rasponu i predstavlja najveću ljudima poznatu strukturu galaktičkog porijekla. A nazad na Zemlji je pokrenut jedan pilot projekat. Slijepe i slabovidne osobe u kolumbijskoj regiji Cali od sada mogu uživati u posmatranju ptica. Audiovodič im pomaže prepoznati glasanje ptica na koje nailaze tokom tura. Projekat je inspiriran Juanom Pablom Culasom, slijepcem iz Urugvaja, poznatom po svojoj mogućnosti da raspozna cvrkut više od 3000 vrsta ptica. Sa jezera Čildir na istoku Turske dolaze snimci neobičnog prevoza. Kočije zimi na ledu debelom gotovo pola metra prevoze mještane i sve veći broj znatiželjnih turista. I za kraj ovog izdanja Preko granice vijest dolazi iz Indonezije. Divlje krokodila, koji je više od 5 godina proveo zaglavljen u gumi motocikla, spasio je mještanin. Grupe za zaštitu životinja pokušavale su uhvatiti tu životinju još od 2016. godine, a u tome je uspio lokalni prodavac ptica uz pomoć prijatelja. To je sve za ovo izdanje Preko granice. Hvala vam za pažnju i vidimo se naredne sedmice.